leaves us with close to 25 minutes for questions. While I'm going through them, I've got my chat box up. I might just kick one off, perhaps to you, Vince. You mentioned pre-commitments in your speech, and there haven't been any political pre-commitments at this stage, but what would be well, I should say, how confident are you that that's the case, given the secrecy surrounding AUKUS and the signing of another AUKUS agreement? And what would be some of the clues, and perhaps Professor Evans, with his political expertise, might give us some cues, what we need to look for the existence of those pre-commitments?
Yes, thanks, Kellie. You're right. If there are classified documents of a joint planning nature, it's conceivable that such classified documents exist that we don't know about. I suspect, and obviously Gareth is a better person to respond on this than me, I suspect that if there were some form of joint planning, it would have to be, it's not just one document. You'd have to have a group that is a high-level meeting that meets regularly. There would have to be, if not the details of what is spoken about within the group revealed, at least its existence would be revealed. I don't imagine, and it's not the case with NATO or with South Korea, that you get a detailed public information transparency about the details of those operations. Of course, they're very highly classified, but we know they exist at the very least. So I would expect that you would get some kind of, the clue would be a formal consultative group that explicitly talks about Australian support for US extended nuclear deterrence. But I'll turn over to Gareth, who I'm sure has more inside information to add.
Well, my only insight in this respect is that governments have an extraordinary capacity to obfuscate on these things, an extraordinary capacity in any area which intrudes on the so-called national security space to maintain a position of absolute deniability. The only way of breaching that wall of security, of secrecy, is through leaking and whistleblowing. There's no way of doing it officially. Forget it. You're never going to get support from the courts. You're never going to get support from the bureaucracy. You're never going to get parliamentary support for legislation, which will open this up. It's going to happen through informal channels, and periodically, of course, it does. And while sometimes that can be irresponsible and quite indefensible in terms of putting at risk sources and all the rest of it, on other occasions it is the meat and drink on which democratic accountability exists. So we have to recognise that in a way that governments are congenitally, I'm afraid, unwilling to do, including my own, looking back.
Thank you, Gareth. This one is also directed to you, Gareth. It looks, it's from Colin. Colin's asking about no first strike declarations.
No first use. Yeah.
Yeah, no, does Gareth think Penny Wong or Richard Marles would be prepared to make that declaration? It's a funny question because we don't have nuclear weapons, but maybe some insight into its use by the United States may assist.
Well, I'm a huge supporter of no first use declarations. Of course, they can be merely rhetorical unless they're accompanied by practical measures of reduced deployment and reduced high trigger alert status and all the rest of it, of course. But nonetheless, it's just an absolute no-brainer, I think, for any country which is serious about pursuing a nuclear-free agenda or a nuclear risk reduction agenda to embrace this. And one of my biggest disappointments has been the absolute unwillingness of Australia to take any risks in terms of challenging the United States in this respect. Joe Biden, like Barack Obama before him, was in fact quite desperate to go down that particular path. His instinct, they talk the language of sole purpose rather than no first use, but it's essentially the same concept. Sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to retaliate, not to take any kind of strike offensive. They wanted to go down that particular path, but got no support whatsoever from their allies. They got no support from the Northeast Asian allies. They got no support from the Central European allies, and they got no support even from Australia, which, you know, has for a very long time, going back to the Canberra Commission and all the other things that I've been associated with, has taken a very, very strong, you know, anti-nuclear posture or nuclear skeptical posture. So I think this is a very easy one for the Albanese government, for Penny Wong, for Richard Marles, God help us, to embrace, and that is to just get out there and overtly and actively support a no first use. I mean, if you are in love with nuclear deterrence and you believe, against the evidence, that you know, it is important to retain a retaliatory capability to concentrate the minds of a potential adversary, yes, you're going to be very reluctant to go down the path of absolute global zero. But for God's sake, go down the path of nuclear risk reduction, and for God's sake, accept no first use as a critical way station on that path.
Thank you. This might be for you, Richard. It's a question about whether our F-35s carry B-61 or 12s. NATO currently carries 100 B-61 12s. US has already built 400 plus. So will B-61 12s come to RAAF Tindal, where our F-35s are now based?
My memory is not good enough, but if they're referring to B-61 nuclear weapons, I assume that's the case, then no, I don't think they will. Not at present. I think the reason for that is the range of the F-35s is not especially favourable, particularly compared with B-52s, but we can expect B-52s armed with long-range nuclear missiles and conventional missiles to be flying out of Tindal, supported, protected by F-35s from Australia, and refueled by relays of Australian tankers to get them to the South China Sea, assuming, of course, the Indonesians have no particular objection to that along the way, and supported by airborne early warning, airborne control and warning aircraft. So Australia provides the screen for that to happen. It is possible. The point is that those F-35s which are being deployed, or are deployed, both US Air Force and other non-US NATO air forces in Europe, with B-61s have got a rather smaller range to deal with in parts of Russia or Belarus. So that would be my answer. I don't know whether Vince has a different position on this. We haven't talked about it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Richard. I noted that only very recently did the B-61 nuclear bomb be authorised for use on the F-35. And there's only particular F-35s that it's authorised on, certain ones that are assigned nuclear emissions. And I think the relevant scenario for that is Europe rather than the Indo-Pacific, yeah, or Australia.
This question looks like it's to everybody. What is the likelihood Pine Gap is being used to relay military intelligence to Israel? What power does the Australian government have to stop that flow of military intelligence to Israel, assuming this is the case, to stop it, given US control of Pine Gap? And 3, how might this loss of power and control of the Australian government be a reflection of how things might be only worse with AUKUS and expansion of the base upgrades at Tindal and other bases? So there's a bit to unpack there.
Well, I'll talk briefly about Pine Gap and Gaza. Yes, I have no doubt that the capability of satellites, signals intelligence satellites, controlled from Pine Gap, which sit roughly over Southeast Asia, going towards the end of the Indian Ocean, have the capability to generate intelligence, communications intelligence, a lot of other signals intelligence, downlinked to Pine Gap, processed at Pine Gap, forwarded to the National Security Agency in Washington, and then under a myriad range of agreements, only revealed to us, as Gareth pointed out, by Edward Snowden's leaking of NSA documents. We know over the past 30 years there have been a number of escalating agreements, and there's a technical capability. There's an historical precedent. We know in 1973, the United States did not ask us when Pine Gap data was forwarded to the IDF. Very important for the IDF strategically then. I'm sure that's the case today. I think it is another example, of course, of the level of integration that Gareth has documented for AUKUS, of our, I think, certainly unresisted, and I would say largely increasingly unthinking integration with, firstly, as Vince was talking about, US nuclear war planning, but equally to American combat operations around the world. And Pine Gap is central to both. Nuclear command and control, nuclear operations against China, very definitely, but equally for, well, genocide in Gaza and our complicity in it. I'm not sure, Kellie, how much of the rest of you want to go on with that, because it might take us a bit of distance away from our core issue.
That's fine. I do have a question for Professor Evans. In terms
Gareth, please, let's
Gareth,
be a little bit egalitarian.
Let's be pals. Look, in relation to a comprehensive and generally objective review, as you spoke about, what would be the catalyst for a Labor government to look at that? You know, what sort of pressure would have to bear on them to say, look, let's have a review. We've got an election coming up. What really would sort of flick that switch for them, do you think, if anything?
Well, nothing. I can't see it. I can't see it happening. I mean, I would love to think otherwise, but I think the only credible option for a complete rethink of where we're going on all of this is an external decision by the United States to bail out of this because of their concern that they're not going to have the industrial capacity to produce enough Virginias to give us or sell us, even with the money that we're giving them, 3 extra. I honestly feel that's the only way through this. The political realities is that any government, any Labor government any Labor opposition, any Labor government is neurotic in the extreme about being wedged on national security issues because of, umpteen decades of demonisation about our commitment to serious and credible defence of the country. And, it's just not in someone like Albo's DNA to even contemplate yielding to that and changing course now. The big opportunity to do that was through a full-scale review at the time that they came into government. They could have got a whole bunch of, very, very serious objective defence people, because there's lots of very serious military personnel, submariners, admirals, who are very, very sceptical, very, very concerned about the AUKUS thing and think it's just going down the wrong path. The opportunity to get all that out into the open was there on day one, but it didn't happen then. Didn't happen with the Defence Security Review a year later, and it's not going to happen now. I wish it were otherwise, but I'm afraid I can't give you any nourishment or any confidence on that front.
Kellie, can I say something there and to Gareth, because we've been talking about this one way or another for more than 30 years, and I recall the time you were speaking very generously to my nuclear weapons class at Melbourne University, and I think I asked you, as a former campaign manager for the Nuclear Disarmament Party during the 1984 election and all the events surrounding that and those huge demonstrations at that time, did it make any difference? And I seem to recall you said something to the effect of, well, personally, it did. It was very unpleasant to be harassed in that way, and every ALP branch harassing members. Then you said, of course, the key matter was that you, Richard, Peace Movement, had a champion in Cabinet. And I think you pointed at that stage to Bill Hayden. The point I want to make is not whether or not there's a champion about that may reverse things. That would be perhaps fantasy to talk about. But the level of pressure that was put on you in those years was not enormous in certain respects. And in many ways, the kind of fate that you're pointing to, quite rightly, that AUKUS brings us to, is much more serious even than we pointed to in the 1983, 84, 85 new Cold War era, which was pretty bloody dangerous.
Can't argue with any of that. Can't argue with any of that, and I despair about the mess that we've got ourselves into, and I despair about my own incapacity with all the alleged creativity of which I'm supposed to be capable. I despair of my capacity to see a way through this. I think the only possible way through this is if a really substantial case can be made having no submarines at all. but rather putting all our defence eggs into the basket of air fighting capability, missile capability, and drone capability, including undersea weaponry. I suspect these are the weapons of the future, which in 30, 40 years' time are going to be far more salient and useful for the defence of the country than any manned submarine capability. And maybe, just maybe, if we can get a debate going about that, rather than having yet another catastrophic, or perceived catastrophic about turn and yet another stuffed up submarine program and yet another stuffed up attempt to recreate yet another program. Maybe we can change the terms of that debate, something will be possible. But there's an extraordinary willingness on the part of all the politicians that I talk to these days to saying, well, the decision's been made, that's it. It may be a total catastrophe, maybe a total cluster F, but it's going to be someone else's responsibility in 2, 3, 4 terms' time to deal with the consequences of that. It's not going to be ours politically. So what the hell? Let's just, focus on things which are less, politically potentially troublesome. And I mean, that's the political reality we're dealing with, and it's very unhappy. Sorry to let you down, Richard. I mean, you've always been a supreme. I thought I was an optimist. You're one of nature's totally incorrigible optimists about this sort of stuff. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the current realities in this context.
I think we disagree largely about the pathway, but let's keep going.
and that's why I mentioned obviously at the outset that we as a advocacy group should not rule out the importance of First Nations in terms of land use and test cases, because there would be plenty of examples where land has been used in a way which was not properly indicated to them at the outset. The Arnhem Space Centre is a perfect point where it was sold as space exploration and scientific research. A town saw the opportunity after mining is sort of moving out, bauxite mining, for jobs and for the town to prosper. But something tells me it wasn't really made clear that the extent to which that site would be used for defence purposes, and particularly in the context of a first strike taking out an adversary satellite. So there would be lots of examples of land use and on First Nations land where their First Nations were not properly consulted. But I've got one final question before Annette does a wrap up tonight, and it looks like to Richard or Vince. Do you think other RAAF bases will receive bombers, e.g. Amberley?
Well, already Amberley receives B-2 bombers in not rotational deployments, but short task force deployments. Tindal has had visits from B-2 bombers. The B-2 bombers are more modern, so to speak, more dangerous for China because they can penetrate Chinese airspace. The visit to Tindal was a matter of repairing an engine, which sounds very techy, but it does tell you we are offering extraordinary capabilities to the Americans. I think the B-52s are the test case. I think there will be B-2 deployments to come. I'm not sure, Vince and I haven't really talked this one through, but I think they'll be there. But certainly the changes which are going on at a whole raft of Northern Australian air bases, from Learmonth on the Northwest Cape through to the so-called bear bases of Sugar and Curtin across Northern Territory, suggests the Americans have asked us to elevate or to open the door more widely in general, technically, what they're technically capable of doing. And then we'll talk, as Vince suggested, later on about how we might go about using them.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Richard said. The force posture agreement is extraordinarily wide open in terms of the kinds of operations and access that the US Air Force and government is enabled to use. We talked about, what's important is not just the rotations of the forces, but the base infrastructure. And this is why we signal out Tindal, because Tindal has the squadron operation facility, the maintenance facility, the big fuel reserves, and so on. Darwin base also has a squadron's operations facility, but it's for use by the US Navy, not the US Air Force. So it's still very significant, but not for the strategic bombers. Just going very quickly back to the Force Posture Agreement, as part of our research and the forthcoming papers that Richard and I are working on Fraser's 1980s policy and also the Rarotonga Treaty, we've been looking at, the various agreements that the Australian government has negotiated with the US government to allow in strategic bombers from the United States. And it's just extraordinary when looking at how this has evolved over the decades, just how wide open the Force Posture Agreement is and just how unprecedented it is. When Fraser negotiated the first agreement to allow B-52s into Northern Australia, as Richard mentioned, it was very globally significant because it obviated the worldwide policy of neither confirm nor deny by getting an explicit acknowledgement from the US government that there were no nuclear weapons, no weapons at all on board. But it was very limited. The agreement was, surveillance and navigation operations. It was landings in Darwin, unarmed, no nuclear weapons, and the terms of the agreement were made public. They were published in Hansard in Parliament. You can look them up. There's the exchange of notes between the Secretary of State, the Australian Foreign Minister, became the treaty, and that was all public. The next kind of iteration of strategic bomber deployments to Australia was in 2005 under the Howard government with the Strategic Bomber Training Program. And there was a new statement of principles that was negotiated. Now, that's classified. It wasn't made public, so we don't know what's in it. From the bits that we do know from, questions in Parliament, we know the agreement expanded the initial 1981 exchange of notes by now, of course, allowing these bombers to be armed. The Strategic Bomber Training Program was US B-52 bombers, but also B-1 and B-2 bombers, using mainly the Delamere Air Weapons Range in Northern Territory for long-range bombing runs. So now we're allowing the Americans to arm the strategic bombers. We're expanding the range of bombers from the B-52s to the B-1 and the B-2. And we haven't asked for an explicit guarantee that there will be no nuclear weapons on board. Now, of course, the US was not going to be dropping nuclear weapons on Delamere Air Weapons Range, but still the principle of adhering to neither confirm nor deny was re-established in that 2005 Statement of Principles. But still, there were limitations there. We get to the Force Posture Agreement, and now we have B-52s and B-2s and B-1s, not just deploying for, being allowed to land at Darwin, not just being used for long-range bombing runs on Northern Territory bombing ranges, but now given access to innumerable number of agreed facilities and areas, which Richard mentioned are classified. And despite Kellie and Richard's best attempts, cannot get any transparency around this. So there's innumerable facilities, we don't know how many. And it's not just about that. The types of missions have been extended in the Force Posture Agreement to not just training exercises or bombing exercises and so on. We've got security cooperation exercises, we've got humanitarian assistance and disaster relief activities, and then we have this extraordinary statement of any such other mutually determined activities. Any such other mutually determined activities, which means, almost anything, right? And then beyond that, the Force Posture Agreement also established, combined logistics sustainment and maintenance enterprise. So pre-positioning stores, munitions, fuel, and so on, to allow the bombers that rotate here to be supported to engage in high-end warfighting, combined military operations, and so on. So when looking at that evolution of the way in which Australia has negotiated successive deployments of B-52 bombers, has become ever more expansive and less transparent in each iteration. And I think that's that's very sad and disappointing, but it's the state of affairs, unfortunately.
Thanks, Vince. And before I hand over to Annette, I'll just say it's also would be interesting to look at the decision by Richard Marles to recruit dual nationals, including Americans, in the ADF, and what that means in reality in terms of alliance to country in a crisis, and who would be giving the orders and whose orders would be followed, and whether that's just a Trojan horse to up the troop numbers without sort of alerting people to it. So that's something also that feeds into the build-up. But look, we could talk all night, but I'm going to hand over to Annette, and I thank you all for such wonderful, rich presentations that have given us a lot to think about. There's a lot to be depressed about, but lots to be hopeful about as well. So I thank you all for joining us, and I'll hand over to Annette.
Well, a big thank you to you too, Kellie. And at the beginning of this webinar, I should have introduced Kellie as one of our most recently agreed to patrons of IPAN. Kellie, along with Ian Lowe, have agreed to be 2 patrons of IPAN, and we're very grateful for the honour of having both of you as patrons. Well, what a fantastic update from our 3 speakers on just how Australia is being prepared as a launching pad for war. It's really hard to avoid that. And the reality is that what war would mean is just not talked about enough. That's how I feel. We talk about preparing on such and such a year for a war with China. And yet the human consequences, the economic, the environmental consequences, and as one of the questioners raised was the issue of refugees. We've had this ongoing issue of dealing with a few boatloads of refugees. Imagine what would happen if there was in fact a war in our region. And it wouldn't only affect China, it would be all of the countries in our region. So, I think we've opened this discussion up again, as we need to keep doing. And in fact, this webinar is a lead event to the upcoming IPAN conference, which we hold every 2 years, because they are a lot of work to organise. It is a fantastic conference with something like 30 different speakers speaking on panels to do with all the issues that we've discussed tonight, particularly as we now reach the 3rd year since this secret agreement was reached and dropped on the whole of us. It was such a shock, I think, for everybody to have the AUKUS announcement made. And, it's hard to believe it was a shock for the likes of Richard Marles. I'd like to know more about that. The recent book that's been published by Andrew Fowler, Nuked, is a great look into the background of the AUKUS agreement. And Andrew will be speaking at the conference, as well as many, many other wonderful and authoritative speakers. So I won't hold you up any longer. It's been a really great webinar. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Gareth. And thank you, Kellie, as well. And I hope to see as many of you as possible at the IPAN conference. You can join online if going to Perth is too difficult, either expensive or just too difficult to get there. But we hope to have many people joining us online, as well as attending the conference in Perth in person. Good night, everyone.